Hello from Philadelphia. My name is Randy Mason, and I'm glad to be joined today by my colleague Laura Alice Watt, who is not in Philadelphia, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. My name is again Randy Mason. I'm a professor at University of Pennsylvania at the Weitzman School of Design, and I direct a research group called the Urban Heritage Project, and we work on a number of different things these days, quite a lot with the National Park Service doing cultural landscape preservation projects of various kinds. As part of that enterprise of applied research and practice, we're ramping up to a series of discussions and conversations and a symposium that will happen this fall about cultural landscape preservation and kind of where we are at the moment as a field of scholars and practitioners and researchers and citizens for that matter. So as part of kicking off that series, we asked Laura Alice Watt to join us for a discussion really centered on her book, which is fantastic. My dog-eared copy is right here, The Paradox of Preservation, Wilderness and Working Landscapes in Point Reyes National Seashore. So the way that we'd like to work this 1 hour or so web-based conversation is to first go through a few practicalities and then give a quick introduction to Laura, ask her to talk a bunch about her book, and then we'll have a little informal Q&A back and forth between the two of us. After 45 minutes or so, we'd love to entertain some questions from those of you joining us from wherever you're joining us from. And so to that end, on the practical side of things, let me first say that this conversation will be recorded, so you can tell your friends and family and colleagues that they can go watch it if they're not joining us live today. Your questions, we ask you to put them in the Q&A tab, and that way we'll have a collection of them to go to at the end of the conversation. And finally, the chat function in Zoom, we'd like to ask everyone, if you have a comment you just want to throw across to the others in the room, feel free to use that. And we'd like everyone to start by just throwing in a little chat about where you're joining us from. So get a little bit of an idea of what our map is of our little micro community this afternoon. So I won't give as we launch in, I won't give a super long bio. I won't read the bio that's on your really great webpage, Laura. But look at Laura's lauraalicewat.com webpage. We'll put that in the chat. I'll just note that you did your PhD at Berkeley. You taught for a long time at Sonoma State University, teaching a number of different topics, which I want to ask you to talk about in a moment. And over the last several years have resettled, I think that was the verb that you used in your bio, in Iceland. So you're joining us today from the West Fjords region of Iceland, as I gather. And I won't go into to more detail about your bio because we'll get into some of that, I think, as we talk about your book. But I wanted to welcome you again and to ask you to maybe just talk about a little bit of positioning in terms of fields of environmental studies and geography and landscape architecture and historic preservation. Your book could be on any number of shelves in the bookstore, in the library. So maybe
that's strategic, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm sure your publisher
made all the shelves.
Your publisher made you do it, I'm sure. But just a little bit about kind of which fields you feel rooted in, and which kind of led you to this amazing topic.
Yeah, and hi everyone. Laura, coming from Iceland. Yes, indeed. Blah, blah, blah. I've all my career, I've had a hard time figuring out what to call myself in terms of what is my field. My undergrad degree from Berkeley was in vertebrate zoology, and I have a master's in environmental policy. That's what I thought I was going to do my PhD in, but then I ended up sort of switching midstream. My major professor was a political scientist, but no one else on my committee was. Took classes in geography, took classes in law, took classes in my environmental studies department. So I've always been kind of all over the map, and I think I kind of like it that way. So the place I call my intellectual home is environmental history, even though I don't have a history degree and I didn't have a job in a history department. So, but that's okay. Environmental historians don't mind folks that come in from elsewhere. But those are the conferences I attended the most. That's sort of the literature I read the most. That's sort of my home.
Great. Could I ask you in a slightly more directed way to talk about your connection to the cultural landscape concept and idea
Yeah,
in terms of your education first before we launch into the landscape itself?
definitely. I failed to mention of all the places that I took lots of classes. I also took a lot of classes in geography. Um, I I can't actually remember exactly where I first stumbled across. I guess it was because my first semester of my graduate program, which is at Berkeley, as well. I went there for undergrad and then came back. Go Bears. Um, my first semester was just a doozy of a semester. I remember taking this political science class in organizational theory that almost killed me. Um, yeah, that was, if I was ever going to drop out of school just from a class, that was the one, along with organic chemistry in younger days. But I was lucky enough, I took environmental history, which was great, told me about this field, but I also took a class, not in geography, but up in the law school. Um, Joe Sachs, just a preeminent environmental law professor, was teaching an elective class just for 2 units that was on preservation law, but was talking about both natural resource preservation, so parks and wilderness and endangered species and that kind of thing, but was also talking about cultural preservation. And so everything from museums to, legal cases with the Amish trying to protect their rights to do things the way they want to do. And I'm pretty sure that class is where I first came across the concept of a cultural landscape. And it really resonated for me that I had come out of a much more natural resource focused background, both biology and natural resource policy and public lands policy. And it was so interesting to see these legal and policy frameworks side by side and to see how much they had in common. And gosh, there's so much that these should be talking to each other more. And so I think that's really where I got sort of pushed in a new direction out of sort of traditional public lands policy and into this direction. And I was fortunate enough to have at Berkeley at the same time was Paul Groth. He was a split appointment between geography and the architecture school. And he was just a gem of a human being. And certainly as a mentor, I took several of his classes. I audited his undergrad classes. And he ended up being one of my core committee members for my thesis. And honestly, is when there were moments, not from classes, but from some of my colleagues in my home department, there were times when it was his cheerleading that kept me in school. Jenny, that's Paul Groth, Groth. Just an amazing, amazing person.
A wonderful person, also a mentor to me very temporarily on my dissertation committee, but a giant among the cultural landscape field because he organized a number of gatherings and edited collections that have really kind of set on our shelves, literally and metaphorically, a kind of a consensus statement about what the issues were in understanding, and more to the point of our talk, using cultural landscape ideas both for study and for practice. So I think he teed up a lifetime of work for the rest of us as well. So could you launch into, I'm sorry,
I
go
was
on.
just going to add that I also had the fortune, I think, of being in graduate school in my PhD program in the early and mid 90s, which was right when there was this big boom in scholars using cultural landscape theory, where I think it had been fairly quiet for a couple of decades. All of a sudden, it was much
Mm.
more of a thing. There were a lot of people talking about it. We had Barbara Bender, who was an archaeologist in the UK, came and did a month-long intensive course on cultural landscapes that I was able to take, that Paul organized. And so it was just sort of this really rich moment in the scholarship as well. And so I think that was fortuitous timing, and it just clicked for me.
Great. Yeah, for those of you who are tuning in, please do throw into the chat a little note about where you're joining us from today, just so we have a sense of that. And Laura, let me ask you to talk about the book itself, because as you know, as we in the Urban Heritage Project are trying to reflect more on how we're doing our work with the Park Service and elsewhere, these these really kind of deeply seated issues about the concept of cultural landscape and its application in practice in the Park Service, but also elsewhere, just create all of these issues that you so beautifully and at length play out in this really extraordinary place that I'm afraid I've never been, but I feel like I kind of know it through your book. But so if you could please talk a bit about Point Reyes.
Yeah, so it's funny. I was talking to a student recently who was saying, "Oh gosh, Point Reyes, everything. It seems like there's always something controversial and sort of tense and intense happening there." And I was like, that's pretty recent. I grew up in the Bay Area. I lived there all my life until I moved here to Iceland, and yet I only sort of first heard about Point Reyes when I was in college, when I went for some hikes there, and it was kind of a sleeper park, if you will. I knew all about Yosemite and Sequoia and those kinds of things, but to someone who didn't study parks, it was maybe a little off the radar back in those ancient dark times. Um, but I in part because of the courses I was taking in grad school, I got really interested in, again, trying to bring together natural resource stuff and some of this cultural landscape stuff that I was reading about. And I got really interested reading about some of the cultural landscape protection efforts that were happening in the Park Service and elsewhere. And I got sort of interested of like, so what happens when you try to protect a landscape that still has the people in it? Because so much of preservation, both historic preservation and sort of the natural resource side of preservation, was all about places that didn't really have people in them, because people are inconvenient. They do stuff and they move things around and they get out of control. And so that was really, I think, it took me a while to get there, but that was sort of the core question that I was asking with my dissertation that then much later became this book, The Paradox of Preservation. The dissertation was done in 2001 and the book didn't come out till 2017. So there was a lot of time in there for it to morph and change, both to hopefully become more readable. Dissertations are not known for their application to the general public, but also for a lot of things to happen at Point Reyes while I was trying to start rewriting this scholarly work and this school work into something that was more palatable to many readers. And I got really interested in, there's been a lot of discussion in recent years, well, in the last 2 decades, 3 decades, about land conservation via private trusts, via nonprofit organizations that purchase development rights from private landowners but don't own land and are just helping people stay on the land. The Marin Agricultural Land Trust was the first agricultural land trust in the country, and it had been formed in 1980, I believe, just right in the same place that I was studying, or just next to it. And so there was sort of a lot of this conversation of kind of like, well, I was sort of imagining if you were a community of some sort, agricultural community or a historic community or whatever, and you wanted to protect yourself in some way, what would you do? Would going with, becoming a cultural landscape park be a good idea, if that was what you were trying to achieve? And or were there other ways of doing that? And we had seen sort of an example further up on the California coast of Mendocino, which had been sort of this cool community of artists and hippies and so forth living in cool old Victorian houses, and they wanted to protect that sense of local character, and so they got designated as a historic district and very quickly could no longer afford to live in their own town. The gentrification that often comes with preservation. And so that didn't seem like a good route. But I was interested in this sort of difference between public protection and private protection via land trusts,
Mm.
and asking that question of a park, a government-owned protected area that still has people working via leases or whatever other mechanism within it, is a publicly owned space with private rights.
Yeah.
And a land trust is the opposite. It's a privately owned space, but with some public interest in that conservation of, trying to prevent development and keep something there. And so I was also really interested in, why does it matter which side of that divide are you on?
Mm.
And so those, I think, are some of the core questions of this book, is sort of, what happens to working landscape when it becomes the target. That's the wrong word, but the subject of preservation efforts.
Yeah.
Because the ideas of preservation are so much about holding things still, and keeping it static. And that doesn't seem to work well with a lot of natural landscapes either, but certainly also well with cultural, where people are still there and still engaged and still working.
Yeah.
Uh,
So you go into to some depth and detail about the concept of wildness and wilderness, and how that is um, how that's really decisive in a lot of ways in trying to tease out how a working landscape also is a preserved landscape. It's kind of like fundamental contradiction. Um, and I do want to talk more about that as a kind of conceptual ongoing question. A question about landscape that's kind of like a landscape itself. It keeps evolving and changing. We can't really pin it down. But I would love to, for those who don't know the book or don't know a bit of the story about Point Reyes getting created in the early 60s and on through your book coming out in 2010s. Could you talk about some of the particular landscape moves that were of most consequence? And I'm thinking about, like, what does the working landscape look like? The ranches, the oyster farm, et cetera.
oh boy, yeah.
Just a couple.
I'll try to, yeah, I'll
I know
try to keep this
it takes
brief.
400 pages to get them all, but
It is a complex story, and it should be, right? That's something I think you and I were talking about a while ago, is how so often the simple story is more appealing, but the complex story is more gets more at the accuracy that we hope for. So yeah, Point Reyes is, for those who don't know this landscape at all, it's a sort of triangular peninsula about an hour north of San Francisco, that sticks out into the Pacific Ocean. It's a little chunk of a geologically different land than the stuff it's the San Andreas Fault separates it from the mainland. And since the 1850s or so, it has been used as a primarily dairying landscape with dairy cows, and creating first primarily butter and cheese when they were still schooners taking you can't take liquid milk in a schooner very easily. It splashes. So they were taking butter and cheese to San Francisco, and then later milk by truck. And then in more recent years, some of those dairies have converted over to beef operations and or shut down completely. Before it was a dairying landscape, in California, people tend to start history in 1850 because that's when the state got created and the gold rush happened, and it's like history started. But of course, there was a lot of history before that. I am not a Native American scholar, and so I don't pretend to know all of that history or to speak for it. But I think it's worth mentioning that part of why people wanted to start dairies at Point Reyes was because the grass seemed really green more of the year. And partly that's because it's a very foggy place and the fog waters the grass. California sort of notoriously has no rain in the summer, and sort of late spring through early fall, 6 months of absolutely no rain. And so the grass turns brown and dies. And if you're trying to keep cattle around, having grass that can stay green longer is better. But the grass was also green because native peoples had been managing that landscape along with most of the rest of the California landscape for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And one of their primary mechanisms was burning to keep the coastal landscape open, to keep it in grass and sort of low shrubs. If you take all management off of most sort of coastal most parts of the sort of mid and
Mm.
central and northern California coast. If you take any management, what form it takes, if you take it off, what you get is coyote brush mostly coming back, which is a very brambly kind of brushy plant. That's fine, but it's not grass. It's not forests. It's not a lot of the other kinds of landscapes that people find useful. And for native people, they would burn that off and get grass back. That would attract animals that they wanted to hunt. Other plants would be able to grow that they needed to use for different things. So it was already a managed landscape. And I think that's why ranchers first came in
Mm.
and said, "Oh, look at these beautiful green fields. We should put cows here." Um, so I think that's an important preamble. Then, okay, ranches up until the 1950s is sort of the next big turn when there's a huge outdoor recreation boom happening across the US. And the Park Service is really ramping up both to improve a lot of the parks that it has, but also to create a bunch of new parks, especially trying to create parks close to urban areas. Um, they wanted to bring parks to the people, as the slogan went, and to take some of the pressure off the big crown jewel parks that were up in the mountains far away from everybody. And Point Reyes got discussed and later proposed as a park location. And there was a lot of discussion between, I think the first proposal was, the first sort of talk about it was in 57, the first formal proposal in 60, and it was created as a national seashore in 62. And in that 5-year period, there was a lot of discussion about how to do this. And sort of the first proposals were to just take some of the branches that had already gone out of business and the seafront, the shoreline, and make those into a park and keep the agricultural land sort of
Mm.
rolling because they were so important economically and culturally to that area. One of my old friends on one of the ranches there said, you know, through my mom's side of the family, I'm related to half of Petaluma, and through my dad's side, I'm related to the other half. You know, this is a very tight knit, small rural community, and so chucking a bunch of people out to create a park didn't really sit well politically, as well as economically. So, but by the time the park got created, that there, like I said, there had been a lot of back and forth about how best to do that. The park did get created with a public use zone that was essentially that original proposal of some closed ranches in the southern part of the peninsula and then the waterfront, and keeping the ranches in a private use zone. But through the 1960s, for a variety of reasons, the land values went through the roof, in part because the Park Service paid too much for the land that they bought, in part because there were some speculators that were trying to subdivide a few one former ranch in particular and sell those off. And anytime you subdivide, that jacks the prices, the land values up. And that made it impossible for the ranchers that were still there to financially hang on. Their taxes, both their property taxes and if there was any change in generations, their inheritance taxes had
Mm.
just gone through the roof. And this was actually really terrifying them by the late 60s, that if someone's father had a heart attack and the ranches, many agricultural operations are land rich but cash poor. And so, but they were already part of a created park, and they weren't allowed to sell their land to anybody but the Park Service, who had run out of money.
Mm.
And so they were caught in this weird bind where they were, if someone passed away, they would have to sell the ranch to pay the taxes because it's about half the value of whatever you have. But they couldn't sell the ranch. So then they were like, we're going to go bankrupt. So by 1970, they went back to Congress, got more money to buy the rest of the land, and then allow ranchers to stay on 20-year, mostly, reservations of use and occupancy, which are a weird mechanism. Basically, you're purchasing a set amount of time by taking less of a purchase price, where you get to stay on as if you still own the land, and then um, not sure what's going to happen after that. So anyway, that's how now the land's all owned by the government. The ranchers are on first as having these reservations, these purchased reservations, and then in the 1990s shifting over to leases or permits.
Yeah.
Different names.
I do want to ask you to talk a bit about the oyster
Yes, that's the
operation
next
as
big
well.
step.
I'm sorry to break in. That one among the I think the fascinating parts of the Park Service part of the story is that once a decision to make something called a park is out there and begins to be implemented, then it takes on momentum, and it takes on a kind of path dependence that leads to these what in retrospect seem like kind of outlandishly bad decisions. Like the oyster farm.
Well, the apologies for going on a bit long, but I think understanding this public land versus private land is really essential to understanding what happens next. Because, like I said, the intention was for a mixed public and private park. And what you end up with is all owned by the government. And the reason why that's key is it gives the federal government the ability to unilaterally make changes, without having a conversation with the other parties necessarily. The other big step that happened in there was in the mid 1970s, a big discussion about, and then a bill passed declaring part of the park wilderness. That happened in 1976. And mostly it's the southern portion of the park, again, where a lot of ranch, it's a tougher landscape for ranching, and more rugged and steep. And so many of those ranches hadn't done well anyway, and had gone out of business long ago. And so anyway, that is the bulk of what got declared as wilderness area. And this was an interesting wilderness area, right? It's been peopled very clearly with, paved roads and power lines and fences and, the whole 9 yards. It's not some sort of very far away, what people tend to think of when they think of wilderness. But the wilderness bill was really kind of set in place to make it into wilderness. And also, very explicitly in the 1970s, the main push for wilderness protection at that time was to keep motorized recreation out. So that was one of the big concerns, especially along the shoreline. They didn't want dune buggies. They didn't want jet skis. They wanted to keep sort of a quieter maritime experience. So that was a lot of again, if you go back and read what people were talking about at the time, that was the main push. But in the 1990s, around the time that the ranches are shifting over to leases, at the same time, the environmental movement is shifting. The 90s were sort of this period of Earth First, a lot of pretty extreme environmentalism, pushing, against logging of old growth forests and so forth. A lot of this very extreme sort of, throwing yourself in front of the bulldozer, chaining yourself to the tree. Julia Butterfly goes up a tree and stays up there for 2 years. And, people really pushing a more extreme version of environmentalism. And the definition of wilderness really shifts during this time, in my opinion, in my scholarship, to being more, this is where you start to see people talking about leave no trace and, really emphasizing that sort of untouchedness, the pristineness of wilderness, where I think in the past it had been more, the wilderness is kind of this nifty zoning law. Essentially, we can plop over something and prevent new changes from happening, not necessarily kicking out old things. So the combination of these things, of this newer, more extreme, more fervent, maybe, definition of wilderness, and some shifts, some other stuff that was happening specifically at Point Reyes, you get a new turn of, I think, some political pressure as well as some just internal policy preferences from Park Service managers to go with this more natural resource slash wilderness focus. And that results with the what was Johnson's Oyster Farm, and in 2005 changed to Drake's Bay Oyster Farm, an oyster farm that had been as part of the Point Reyes landscape since the 1930s, quite a long time, suddenly got targeted as a huge problem and obstacle for wilderness designation of Drake's Estero, which is a big estuary right in the middle of the park.
Mm.
And suddenly it became this incredible controversy. And I was very surprised to find myself as I had just gotten my job at Sonoma State in 2006, so a year earlier, and was just, starting to sort of think, oh, right, dissertation, I should turn that thing into a book. Fumbling around with this thing that I had written 5 or 6 years earlier. And people were calling me up going, do you have a quote about this oyster farm and all the controversy? And I was like, what are you even talking about? The oyster farm is controversial? Like, did somebody get sick? Like what? So long story short, the oyster farm was forced out so as to create to shift the designation for the estero from potential wilderness to wilderness. These are legal terms. The only reason it had ever been labeled as potential wilderness was because the state of California retained fishing and mineral rights. So it could not become federal wilderness because the federal government didn't own it entirely. But it got recast as this agriculture bad, wilderness good story in the public sphere. Even though the oyster operation was been there for a very, very long time, in fact, was one of the last vestiges of a thriving maritime economy that had been in this place for a long time. It was the last oyster cannery in the state. It was the oyster shell coming from that. Oyster cannery means that they take the oysters out of the shells and put them in jars, as well as selling them in the shells. And that means they generate huge piles of shells, which other oyster operations don't necessarily pile up because people take them home. And those oyster shells were being used for all kinds of restoration projects around the bay, as nesting material for birds and for other sea life. And so there were a lot of reasons why, in my view, the oyster farm was actually an environmental good, even though it was an economic use in a park. There's a lot of economic uses in parks when you get right down to it.
Yeah.
And yet it got politically cast as both a right-left kind of argument, as well as an environment versus industry argument. And unfortunately, kind of facts went a bit by the wayside during this argument.
You don't say.
A very frustrating experience to be in the middle of, saying, but history.
Yeah.
So now right as I finished the book, it was very strange to be trying to write a history when I don't know the ending yet. It was like, what's going to happen? The oyster farm was shut down in 2014, I believe. And I finished the book in 2016. And just at that time, I was like, I'm really worried that next is the ranches are next. Because once you start positing the agriculture that's been there for centuries as this environmental harm, as this negative, economic harmful thing, then it's all going to go. And that's exactly what's happened since then.
Wow. So we'll wait for volume 2 next in a few
No,
years.
I'm not writing that one. Someone else can take it on.
Yeah.
I still get called. I got called a few weeks ago by a reporter asking me about, so what do you think about the latest thing that's happening with the ranches? I think
well, you wrote the book on it, so I'm sympathetic with the reporters calling you up, as we called you up.
Yeah.
Among the things that I think is really really remarkable about the book and how useful it is to folks interested beyond that particular landscape and those particular issues is that it interweaves this really detailed story about this one particular place and all the transformations that that the people and the organisms and the land undergo as these different ideas kind of like, wash over it, a park, wilderness, economy and such. What you interleave with that, though, is also a history of how the Park Service is trying to take this cultural landscape idea and in kind of fits and starts and bursts and retreats, trying to operationalize it
Yeah.
with different, and with full realization of the contradictions built into not just thinking about a working landscape and a preserved landscape, but how to recognize through tools that are kind of hewn through preservation policy, the ongoing lives of the landscape and the not the possibility, but the reality that those take on value as well.
Yeah.
And the arbitrariness of the line drawn around period of significance or what have you. So I think that you bringing together those different stories, even within chapters, and it's not like there's the Park Service part of the book and then the Point Reyes part of the book. I think that, that captures some of the complexities in a much more real way for me. Can you talk a little bit about what your perspective on Point Reyes kind of indicates to you about the capacity of a park organization? It doesn't have to be the Park Service to use cultural landscape ideas to manage land. You talked about the difficulties of property as a kind of reality of economy of ideas about wilderness, and so there are lots of barriers in the way. But do you think that how do you see in a positive, not totally cynical way the prospects for cultural landscape preservation based on this
Yeah,
story?
and I'm glad that you called out the knitted togetherness of the Point Reyes story and the Park Service story, and really kind of a story that goes beyond the U.S. Park Service and is really much more about preservation as an impulse. Because I really did not want this simply to be a book about Point Reyes, in part because it is somewhat unusual, and I didn't want people to say, "Oh, that's just just a one-off. It has
Right.
no relevance to anything else."
Mm.
Like, no, this is actually, uh, you know, uh, a bellwether kind of park in a way, because was originally trying to hold a lot of moving parts within its boundaries. And I think it has a lot of lessons to teach to any efforts to. And it's funny, I was thinking about this earlier today. I'm really shy of using the word preserve because it has such a, as well as restore, they both have such an impulse of going backwards in time, which we can't do. And so I try to say, protect and rehabilitate, or, use other words that are more forward moving, because part of the problem with them, I think, is that tendency to think you're going to be able to go backwards, which you can't do.
Yeah.
Um, so in that sense, I think when you look at cultural landscapes in the academic sense, they're really there. It's about identifying a process more than a thing. It's sort of the trying to see the processes by which landscapes shift over time with people in place. This is sort of, Paul, my mentor, Paul Groth's definition was just landscapes are the interaction of people in place through time. And so to me, that I think of landscape as a tool for understanding those interactions over time. And I think where we run into not necessarily problems, but challenges, is when something is a tool, but then it's also the thing that you're trying to protect.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because we need to know which of those we're talking about when we're having a conversation. Because I think all too often, it's not that you can't have both, but that if you're talking about one, but you really mean the other,
Mhm.
then you run into problems. And I think the tendency of probably almost any government agency, because they do like certainty and having things sort of buttoned up and we know what's going to happen next, having the landscape as a thing is a lot easier to deal with than the landscape as a tool for understanding interactions.
Right.
um,
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the hallmarks of all preservation and preservationist action it's based on some kind of classification, right? Making discriminations about value or about other
yeah,
kinds of distinction. Um, the one theme that I wanted to call out, based on what you just said in your kind of interwoven history of the Park Service, is that at largely in the same moment, as the four different types of cultural landscape are codified. It's also a time of real foment and creativity in creating different kinds of green line parks. Everything from heritage areas. I would throw Main Street in there as a non-park service kind of preservation effort that's
yeah,
more about process and partnership than about classifying something as valuable or not. So I think that there are, part of the kind of the struggle to deal with cultural landscapes as property. There were lots of different takes on that.
yeah, yeah. It's funny, my original idea for my dissertation, which, everybody always has the original idea, is huge and totally undoable. And my original one actually was going to involve three different countries. I was going to, oh my God, we don't even need to go into that one. But the second iteration was I was going to compare three different parks created at different times in the Park Service's history. And one would have probably been Shenandoah, in the 1930s, where, all the residents got kicked out instantly,
Hmm.
to create this vision of wilderness conveniently close to the seat of power in DC. Then Point Reyes would be my midpoint park, and then a more recent one would be some of these green line or partnership parks where the Park Service is one landowner of many, and so necessarily at a table of numerous managers having a
Right.
conversation about how to go forward.
Yeah.
And that does seem like a key variable to me, not because private property is sacrosanct and it's the most important thing in the world, not at all. I'm not a property rights activist, but that it having not all of the ownership cards in the federal government's hands, even if some is in state government or in local nonprofits or whatever other entities are participating, it means the federal government doesn't have this unilateral power to simply just change direction.
Yeah. Um,
And even I do want to say, because I realize we're getting a little short of time, it's also that it's not that you can't change direction. If what folks want, both in the Park Service and the public and elsewhere, if what they want is no more working landscapes, let's have wilderness, I have nothing against that, except that when it's not being talked about openly,
hmm.
that is the goal. What I don't like, and what got me very unhappy during these 20 years of working at Point Reyes, was the official support of ranches and working landscapes and so forth on the one hand, but actions that were pushing them out on the other. And when it was very obvious that the actions were doing this, but they're like, oh, no, 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 that's not our policy. Our policy is support. You're like, yeah, no, it's not. It's this. You're pushing them out. And so I think it's having that strength and fortitude, political or otherwise, to say this is a change we want to make. We need a new kind of landscape here. This one isn't working for us for whatever reason. We need to go somewhere new.
Yeah.
And for everybody to understand that that's the effort. It's not that change can't happen.
Yeah. So this orientation to change is a real bugaboo when it comes to connecting anything that has preservation in the title of it with cultural landscape, because as you've noted in half a dozen ways, it's not as if they can't be reconciled, but there is something in the wiring of cultural landscape as a concept and preservation as a concept and practice that seem to be at odds. Um, One of the ways I typically introduce this in teaching, mostly students in preservation, is this great essay by Bob Cook, is a botanist and ecologist at the Arnold Arboretum for a long time. And he
Oh,
wrote this
fantastic.
great essay called "Is Landscape Preservation an Oxymoron?"
Mhm.
And he goes on to give his his understanding of what preservation is, which is about stopping change.
Mhm.
And then that landscape is based on ecology. It's about understanding and modeling and,
Right.
going with change. So he does us the great service of getting it kind of wrong, because preservation is like, that's the kind of cartoon character version of preservation. There are all these, and this is where I think your book, turns it from a black and white illustration to a color illustration, in that there are all these different efforts to try to accommodate change, to incentivize change, whether it's tweaking policies or property relationships, whether it's new kinds of management structures like land trusts, green line parks. I think we've been experimenting, not we, the whole field has been experimenting for a couple of generations, to make change something that can be shared between a preservation impulse and a cultural landscape impulse. I think one of the positive lessons I draw out of your book is that this is not all failures, but there are a lot of lessons in it as well about how one could approach it differently.
Yeah. And I think one of the keys to that approaching things differently is to not fall for their sort of idealizations, whether they be historic idealizations or natural slash wilderness idealizations. When everything gets kind of boiled down to a single definition and a single story. And I think that, you know, that's a problem not just in parks and preservation, but worldwide.
Mm,
When because people do become very emotionally invested in that one definition, and that's really what a lot of wilderness protection is not about the ecological reality on the ground. It's about protecting my experience as a recreator to have a solitude experience. And I'm someone who enjoys that. I live in an incredibly remote part of the world now, is
yeah.
part because I wanted to get away from all the rest of the world. And I have my wilderness experience right outside my window.
And
Um,
it's, again, like I feel like I should be getting a cut of your royalties because I'm so
ah,
enthusiastic about another point that I appreciated, that especially late in the book, but throughout in the photographs, in the text, you do talk about the experience of being in the place and walking in the place. It's not all about policy and which superintendent did what and things, and the kind of the more dry bones of history. It is really about the kind of the flesh and experience as well, which is such an important part of why we are, attracted to this notion of cultural landscape, I think,
yeah,
because it
yeah.
centers on people's experiences of places.
It's people's experiences and noting the reality of how the natural world contributes to that as
Yeah.
well. That you can't ever, when I do teach still, which is rare these days, but I do a little bit. Um, I always, I've stopped using the term cultural landscape and natural landscape, and I just talk about landscapes because there
Mm.
is no entirely natural landscape and there is no entirely cultural landscape. They're always a blend. And to me, that's what's powerful about it and why I enjoy being in really natural spaces where there are human stories, both present and past,
Yeah.
and future for that matter, that you can experience and become part of or become and get into conversation about. Um, and it's when things get sort of delineated into a single definition. Was important because this battle happened in 18, blah, blah, blah. Or because this is empty of humans, which of course is not true because you as a recreator are there and the managers are there in a
Yeah.
way managing it. And so, it's those idealizations that become the problem for being able to deal with change and complexity, I think.
Yeah. So if you don't mind, we
Yes.
have about 10 minutes left in what we'd originally set aside as an hour. We do have a couple of questions that have popped in the Q&A. Encourage you to, those of you out there, to keep typing away in your questions. But I'll just read a couple if that's okay,
Great.
and
Thank you.
let you riff on them. So Daniel Straub, thank you, Daniel, wrote a question that I think taps into where you just left off in terms of, if landscape is about encompassing experience, it's somehow working against the way that disciplines kind of like separate our different like types of experience and push us
Yep.
in, more single-minded directions. He says, I'm fascinated that your work covers both natural resources and cultural resources. I'm also interested in the other aspects of preservation and cultural preservation that address the lighthouse and how a critical building sometimes becomes a critical component of a cultural landscape. Can you comment on that? Like,
I can try.
yeah,
I'm kind of not as versed on the architectural side as some would think I might be. Um, that was a very awkward sentence, pardon me.
even better, I would say. Yeah.
Um, and so, obviously the individual structures can be, I mean, lighthouses in particular are something that just, instantly give a sense of um, people passing. The reason the lighthouse is there is to keep people on the ocean safe, and especially when they're coming in close to shore, and that's what the fishermen are doing. And so it instantly gives this sense of utility and history and even a little romance maybe to places that they are. And one of the interesting things about going through this whole Point Reyes story, as I was going through all the old records and so forth, is to see how people's definition of what's historic has changed as well
Mm,
over this period of time from the late 50s to now. When the first Park Service historian went out to Point Reyes in kind of the mid 60s, the park had been around for a few years already. They went out for half a day and drove around, and they said, well, we'll probably need a second visit to see if there's anything out here that's historic, except for the lighthouse and the old lifeguard life-saving station. And there was one other thing, the Olima lime kilns, bizarre, little weird old mines. None of the ranches were considered historic because they were a dime a dozen. There's ranches
yeah,
everywhere. Now that, small family-run ranches are becoming, this, almost anachronistic part of the agricultural industry. Suddenly they're historic. So in that sense, structures like the lighthouse or now the old farmhouses are so important for setting that tone, for giving that sense of contributing to that sense of place. But I think it's also important to remember that it's the people's work building those things and maintaining them over time that keeps, if you just keep
mm,
the structure and throw the people out, it's not the same thing. Um, and one of the ways that a lot of the historic preservation law and policy works against this is with like the concept of integrity. A farmhouse that had a Victorian farmhouse that has the best integrity is one that has not changed at all since it was built in 1883. And those are the farms that usually weren't doing very well economically. It couldn't afford to change anything.
yeah,
But the ones that were doing well in the 1930s, they put in, or not the 30s, but the late 40s or the early 50s, they put in the big picture window because that was cool and they had money to spend because they were doing okay. And yet that throws their farm into having less integrity, even though it's the more lived, more
yeah.
deeper part of the current cultural landscape.
It has more layers, more richness, more complexity, and therefore is a better, if we can use that term, cultural landscape or better representation of those landscapes. Yeah,
Or just two facets of it. I'm not
yeah,
sure one is necessarily better or worse, but the tendency is to throw those ones out, to say,
yeah.
oh, they're no good. They're
Well, I think
too new.
better is not the right word for sure, but more in terms of the point you made earlier on about the like a complex place is more valuable or better than a place where the story has been so simplified or maybe even mythologized.
Yeah.
If I can go to another question, Tara Genming Kai asks, Laura, could you speak about the notion of the Leopoldian Park, which you
Mm.
use in the book? Additionally, I'm curious to know if your research on Point Reyes alters your understanding, definition of cultural landscapes within the different legal frameworks like the Park Service, UNESCO, et cetera.
Mm. Um, I'll start with Leopold.
Yeah, see where it leads you.
I've read more of him. It's funny because there have been some folks that have pushed back on my use of my claim that a Leopoldian park is one that has land use and for economic reasons and land use for um, resource protection reasons.
Mm.
Um, I think by folks who have read Leopold as the the person who gets transformed by a sense of the wild. If you've read any Leopold, reading his description of he was a game hunter for the Forest Service for a lot of his early career in New Mexico, and he writes about hunting this wolf and shot her, but she's not dead. And he chases after her and he finds her and, sees the green fire dying in his eyes. And I still get chills every time I even say it because I've read it a gajillion times. And it's a very moving and powerful story of him understanding that, in his case, predators are part of the mountain. They're part of the wild. Removing them is a problem, because then you're altering the natural world.
Mm.
But he also, wrote his in Sand County Almanac is writing about a beat up old farm that his family bought and started bringing back not only into its natural glory, but into its use as a farm. And that's really where I think he was able to hold his whole insight was to see that humans are part of the natural world, as well as all the different parts of the natural world are part of the natural world, the
Mm.
predators included. And I think he really was striving toward the end of his career to think about them together. And that's why I think that Point Reyes could be, if it's allowed to continue to be, I think it has been. I'm not sure it will continue to be a Leopoldian park in the sense that it has a big wilderness area and it has active, vibrant, small scale agriculture that are coexisting side by side. And in recent years, there's been efforts to bring the Creighton Rancheria, which represents the Miwok tribe and sort of the Native American institution that for that part of California, to bring them into a co-management kind of relationship. And I don't know any of the details of that. I haven't been keeping up on the latest events, so I'm not sure where that is at this
Mm.
point. But that would be great too, to bring, not to the exclusion of ranches, not to say, yes, these people, no, not those people, but to really represent the full richness of the history of this place. And so that's where I think Leopold comes in, is that people and the wild,
Yeah.
and not one excluding the other, not
Yeah.
pushing things to opposites. As for the cultural landscape policy, I'm not good at that stuff.
Well, I would just the literally a literal footnote to your great kind of like building out of why a Leopoldian sense is like worth really exploring. One could make similar arguments from the side of kind of culture or building or hiking or walking. There are all these great literary takes on walking and the virtues of walking, from everything from Rebecca Solnit to Thoreau and everyone in between. And that's I hear those in kind of the same vein.
Mhm.
Um, so there's one more question I think we have time to cram in if you don't mind. It's
I don't mind at all. I
from
can stay as long as people want me here.
okay, as we were joking before, until the sun goes down, which is hours and hours away in Iceland.
Yeah, it's around 10 o'clock around here these days.
Well, just to honor everyone's time, this is a question from a great old colleague, Manish Chalana. Thanks, Manish, for joining us. I'll go to the very end of the question just to kind of get to the crux vis-a-vis what you'd been saying. Um, do you know if anything? Sorry. Do you know if anything has changed in recent times with respect to cultural landscape management within MPS, based on the kind of continual issue of wrestling with vernacular and ethnographic landscapes?
Um, this is such an awkward moment. I took a retirement from my university in 2021. Um, the couple of years before I took retirement, I was doing a lot of faculty governance stuff, so wasn't as active on the scholarship side. And then pandemic hit, and then I ended up relocating. Um, I feel I'm fairly out of the loop in terms of current status of sort of, what policies are working, what aren't. I've tried to keep my eye at least on what's happening at Point Reyes, although staying out of the thick of things.
Mm,
And their things have not changed, which is unfortunate, even though there's been a lot of staffing changes, there's been a lot of planning efforts, there's been a lot of um, lawsuits. It's become a battleground that just kind of refuses to stop being a battleground, which is unfortunate. Um, but in terms of other, I think there are around the world, there's certainly there's a lot of conversation about how to try to do landscape protection, whether it be cultural, natural, with change, because I
mm,
think, especially in the last, I don't know, 10, 20 years, there is more recognition that both of those involve a lot of change and that change itself is fairly natural. And that trying to hold things still leads to problems.
yeah,
Certainly in my former part of the world, a lot of, trying to keep things exactly as they are all the time led to a lot of fire suppression, led to incredible flammability, which
yeah,
part of why I don't want to live there anymore. Um, and so I think there's a lot more conversation about dynamism in landscape and how to try to get political and policy tools and mechanisms to work with changing conditions.
yeah.
And it's hard. It's a big challenge. I wrote an article that came out just before the pandemic hit, so it's instantly dated, unfortunately. I had this long list of crazy things that are happening in the world, and a, a big crazy thing that hit in March 2020 wasn't on it. But anyway, that an essay about uncertainty and how uncertainty is actually the more normal state of affairs. And that really the 20th century was almost an aberration of having far more certainty in the world than had ever happened before and may ever happen again. But a lot of our environmental laws and cultural preservation laws are based on things being certain. The NEPA, the doing environmental impact statements, you have a no action alternative, which assumes that if you don't change anything, everything will just continue on forever.
Yeah,
And that you can predict how policy changes will have outcomes. And we're living in a world where we can't make those predictions anymore.
yeah.
Um,
Well,
and
so
so I think that's the difficult thing going forward is how to get law and policy to work with things that change in unexpected ways.
I do hope you'll share that essay with us,
Oh, yeah.
and
It
we will share it around if that's okay.
Yeah, it was published in the historical quarterly, the Utah Historical Quarterly, if I'm remembering right. It's an odd
I
journal. They
think
were
my
doing a special
subscription might have
issue
run
on.
out, so you have to send it to me.
I have PDFs. Just email me. I will send.
Great. Let me just wrap up with a couple practical things. First of all, thank you so much, Laura, for spending the time in preparing for this and having this talk. It won't be the last time that we're all in conversation because we have in the next several weeks a couple more of these conversations with other colleagues, Brenda Williams and colleagues from Quinn Evans, and there was as well as some colleagues from the Park Service, Julie McGilvray and Bob Page in June. So May 28th and then June 25th are our next virtual conversations. You can get the details of that by looking at the webpage of the Urban Heritage Project from Penn School of Design. I think my colleagues will pop that URL into the chat. And then in November, we're going to gather in person here in Philadelphia on the 14th and 15th. Present company and others to discuss in more detail and in more intensity, kind of ways forward from these different perspectives, given these different perspectives on cultural landscape and its application to these things called preservation and maybe conservation and maybe other things as well. So we really appreciate not only your book, but your walking us through it and helping us deal with some of these complexities and uncertainties.
Oh, thanks so much for inviting me. This was a real treat. And I'm
Great.
hoping to be able to join you in November.
We sure hope so. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and please stay in touch with us through the Urban Heritage Project website. Great. Good. good afternoon, good evening, and I don't know how to say goodbye in Icelandic, but
Go the note. Good night.
thanks, Laura. Thanks all.